funeral, I don't know if you remember that, of tanks crushing protesters. And this was clearly getting quite serious quite quickly. And I think this is one of the points that I want to draw out on this question about, you know, humanitarian or aggression, is that very, very rarely in international relations, still less in conflict situations, is it a straight right or wrong situation. Absolutely, this is the thing to do, or we must do nothing, because clearly every piece of evidence says this is the time to stay away. You know, Gaddafi didn't give anyone the luxury of conducting a full risk assessment, and that is one of the difficulties. And I think, you know, it's all very well, blessed hindsight, to look back and say, well, you know, on balance, I'm not entirely sure that would have happened, or let's look at all the problems that subsequently took place. And, you know, didn't you see that tribe was going to be so problematic? Because we certainly did, which is why we never talked about it ever, you know, until it happened. And, you know, I think, you know, for those of you, any of you who have aspirations to go into politics, you know, this is maybe one of the things that you'll find, that often it's a hard decision that needs to be made, and you make a choice. And as I say, you know, we'd had the situation in Egypt and Tunisia, and, you know, the Western world, and indeed the Arab world, was confronted with a choice. Either we stand back, do nothing at all, just hope this man decides to stop, although he has shown absolutely no evidence of that. You know, or else we intervene and do something. And don't forget as well, it's not just a humanitarian question. There are strategic imperatives as well. Namely, if you are talking about caring about democracy and caring about human rights, and yet you do nothing when confronted with a man who is willing to use extreme violence to subjugate his population, but you're very happy to support human rights in countries such as Egypt and Tunisia, what message do you think that sends to the people in the worst dictatorships? What you're basically saying is, we support, that is we, the West, anyone else you want to talk about, we support human rights and democracy, just so long as your dictator is only moderately bad. Just so long as they are not willing or able to pull the trigger. But if they are, as was the case in Gaddafi's Libya, as has been the case in Mr. Ahmadinejad's Iran and elsewhere, if they are willing to pull the trigger, then no thank you. We're going to take a step back. And I think that to have sent that message, particularly, as I say, in the context of what's taken place in the rest of North Africa, or much of North Africa, would have been very, very damaging indeed. And as I say, there's the other question we have to ask as well is, well, Western interests. Is the fact that Western interests being pursued another sufficient cause to oppose this intervention? Because this is actually an argument that has been made on a number of occasions, and it is made by, as I say, generally the sort of the anti-war, heavily inverted quote that, you know, I was speaking the other day against a chap called John Rees, you may not have heard of. He's part of the sort of hard left socialist, you know, one of the conveners of the Cairo conference, which is basically the largest annual gathering of terrorists and socialists. Sorry, I'm not sounding like Joe McCarthy, but I mean, it is basically, it is Hamas, Hezbollah, and various other hard leftist groups, and they all come together and basically talk about how evil Western governments are and how it is absolutely impossible for Western governments to do anything right. And so this argument that Western interests might be involved, you know, it's about oil, or you know, it's about shoring up our position in the wake of, you know, the Arab Spring, you know, and therefore it is not the right thing to do. You know, I would urge you all to eject that from your thinking. Just because something serves our interests, and bear in mind, as a democracy, one would hope that we would elect governments that do pursue our interests. That's what they're meant to do. That if that also is in the service of the human rights of people in another country, that those two things can co-align. And it may well be that, as a consequence of this intervention, you know, the southern Mediterranean littoral will be that bit more secure than it was before the intervention. Does that mean automatically that those lives that were saved, that we shouldn't have done it because it wasn't completely pure insofar as having absolutely no vested interests were concerned? Well, that's not the way the world works. And so, again, you know, I think just keeping those sorts of considerations in mind is quite important. Actually, this is something that, you know, we argue, and I argue quite strongly at the Henry Jackson Society, which is that actually the foreign policy of Western governments in the Middle East, in North Africa and elsewhere for a long time has been very amoral. We have been working on the basis that these dictators, these autocrats, are, you know, they might be a bit unpleasant, but yes, they are nonetheless the surest guarantors of our oil supplies. They can keep a lid on Islamist extremism and so on and so forth. Well, I think the uprisings in the Arab Spring have demonstrated that is demonstrably false. The form of government a country has does also impact on how much of a useful strategic partner it is to countries in the West. You know, if you want stable and secure oil supplies, you don't go to Iran or Libya. You go to Canada and Norway, right? Because they have governments that not only respect the human rights of their citizens, but by consequence are a bit more stable and are a better long-term bet, frankly. And there is a reason why we're investing so heavily in green energy at the moment. And it's not just about combating climate chaos, let me tell you. It's because we recognise, as a country, that we are in an extremely dangerous position if we remain hostage to countries with autocratic governments that you know, on which we depend for our oil and gas. So, as I say, there is very much a utility between pursuing a foreign policy that does promote these things and one that you know, is also actually beneficial to the human rights of the citizens in this country. In fact, I would say those two things are not mutually exclusive, but in fact they complement each other rather necessarily. Now, I'm not entirely sure how long I've been rambling on for and how much longer you want me to ramble on for. I was going to go into, because I thought, well, I'm not going to have enough to say on Libya. I was going to go into a broader analysis of this whole concept of humanitarian intervention as a concept, and this juxtaposition between state sovereignty on the one hand and human rights on the other. And those two things, as you probably know, the international lawyers or any of the other of you amongst us who have an interest in foreign affairs, that those two things are the bedrock on which the UN Charter, which is the basis for most international law when it comes to conflict and international relations of this nature, is built. And why it is that you have these two pillars sitting side by side, and yet they so often come into conflict when it comes to protecting human rights. I can talk about that, or I can shut up. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Right. So, I think this is an interesting thing to consider. So, why is it that you have the UN Charter, which, as I say, on the one hand, it seeks to respect state sovereignty, absolutely a core pillar of the UN Charter, uphold fundamental human rights and social progress in larger freedom, and individual self-determination. These things are key. And the reason, of course, is quite straightforward, which is that the UN Charter was founded in the closing months of World War II, the unimaginable awfulness that was. And the founders of the Charter were presented with a very clear set of lessons, namely that the experience of the preceding decades, and indeed centuries, had been that the greatest threat to human rights was the aggressive tendencies of external states towards each other. And that manifested itself in, most obviously, the policies of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, but also on occasion, frequently, the United Kingdom, France, and others. Now, we are now in a situation, 50 years on, where the greatest threat to human rights comes not from external governments, whatever you may believe, but it comes internally. It is the governments of countries that are persecuting their own people. You look at Africa, the vast majority of conflicts on that continent are civil rather than international. And this brings us to a very tricky situation.